Hello everyone, this is part 2 of the room restoration project. In part 1 I covered how I overboarded the ceiling. In this episode I will be working on insulating the walls, so overboarding it with insulated plasterboard. The main reason I went for insulated plasterboard is to help keep the bills lower in the winter. So this rear room is an extension of the house, so all 3 walls are basically external facing walls, so it gets really cold in the winter. It's basically the same temperature as outside, which is not great, especially when the bills are getting more and more expensive every year. Before I go into how I installed the insulation board, I just want to go over some of the things that you should watch out for. So if you do go for insulated plasterboard, you should watch out for U values. There are building regs that specify your target U value depending on what sort of build you have. On new builds, it's actually very high and you have to get really thick board, but on existing houses that aren't extensions, in my case, I actually found out that it's not an extension, it's just a part of the house. So my value was below 0.30. That was the target. And I had some trouble finding what the best way to calculate it was, but then I found this website, and once I input all the layers of brick and sort of plaster and insulation I had, it came out to 0.27, which was just below what I needed, which is good. The next thing you need to consider is what sort of brickwork you have. If you have solid walls, there is a good chance that you're going to have condensation build up on the inside of the brickwork, as it's basically a very cold surface meeting a warm surface, and it's just going to create an environment for water and penetrating damp. In my case, I have cavity walls, so I'm not too worried. I'm also very certain that the reason the damp that I had on that wall was because the previous owners had a sink there, and that just created the perfect environment for a lot of moisture. If you do have solid walls, you need to damp proof and also create a cavity for your insulation. In the picture you can see that there is a sort of tape and then wall battens, and then you put your plasterboard on top of that via mechanical fixings. In my case, I'm just able to use adhesive. So I started off by cutting around the carpet just to clear out the space. I removed any skirting and electrical boxes. I found that the easiest way to remove the skirting was to pry it with a scraper and a dull chisel, and then sort of carefully hit down any nails. The brick behind it was quite fragile, so I had to be careful with that. The next thing I moved on to was the wallpaper, or anything that sort of was stuck to the walls that could inhibit the adhesion or mounting of the plasterboard once that was on. I also removed the air vent cover that was home to a lot of spiders, so I'm happy that has gone. I decided to cap this air vent off as it was not aerating the cavity at all. It was just a sheathed square hole that goes from the room to the outside. With the sink removed and no other major sources of moisture, I don't think it's too much of a concern. To control the humidity, I'm planning to just monitor it with a humidity sensor and opening the window, so it's I'm not too worried. The plastic I glued to the inside of the outer air vent, and that just helps any sort of water ingress from happening for the time being. This is a temporary solution. I am going to go out and from the other side remove the air vent and reinstall the bricks. It's just that at the moment it's quite rainy and windy, so I am on the first floor. It's not the best time to do that. So you can just see how I'm gluing in. I thought about this wooden frame window quite a lot, and in the end I decided that I liked the frame. So I basically thought of ideas of how to extend the wood so that it would match the new depth of the wall once the insulation board is in place. But if it all did go wrong, then I could still backtrack and overboard it from the inside. So I started off by carefully removing the framing and then set it to one side. I then cut back the sill part, so the bottom piece of wood, so it's roughly around the same depth as the wall. To extend the wood, I purchased some boards. I tried to match the new wall depth as much as I could. The insulated plasterboard I'm using is 62 millimeters. I then added another centimeter to accommodate the adhesive. I was unable to find the exact depth, so the thickness of the wood, which would have made my life easier because then I could just clamp it from the inside of the cavity where the foam was. But in my case, the wood was a bit too narrow, so I had to install some temporary mounting on the outside. This made sure that I had a flat surface between the two woods. I then used Gorilla Glue to give it that permanent sort of fixture. I also drilled pilot holes and then used some really long screws. This just basically made sure that any of the excess glue was pushed out and there was a good clamp between the two woods. I did this for all three sides. I didn't do anything for the sill yet, as I'm going to be getting just a sill cover. The last thing I had to patch before I could start overboarding was this large hole in the floor. The previous owners had a sink here, so I assume this is where the pipes came out from the floor. I first started by trimming down the wood with a multi-tool, so I could basically have two joists underneath exposed. I then cut down a bit of chipboard and installed that. The chipboard didn't perfectly match the depth of the floor, so I padded it out a little bit with MDF. This made the transition pretty much seamless. Once it's covered over with the carpet, no one would know that it's been modified. I also noticed that the other boards were not fully mounted in. The nails and stuff were all sort of missing. So I mocked out any existing pipes just so I don't hit them with a screw, and then fully mounted them in into the floor joists. That made the floor sturdy again. Now that the walls are pretty much prepped, I could start measuring out and trimming the plasterboard to fit each wall. To get a perfect depth between the angled part of the ceiling and the wall, I measured out the depth of the insulated plasterboard plus the adhesive. I just used a bit of random plasterboard here that acted as the 1 centimeter extra for the adhesive. I also made sure to mark out any features like skirting, which I won't be removing because the pipes are in front of the skirting and I didn't want to move that too much. I also marked out the rough placing of any wall sockets and switches. I'm going to be creating brand new cutouts for any electricals, so I'm not too worried about keeping them aligned. Whilst I was doing the trimming for the plasterboard, I did notice that my floor felt a bit out of plumb, so I took a laser level out and it came up to about a centimeter, which is not too much. Anything that is within a couple centimeters, you can probably find to cut it as normal, and then use foam filler to get any gaps out of the way. I did introduce a centimeter to 2 centimeter gap between the floor and the plasterboard. This is just to give any sort of expansion area. Each wall I marked out individually and mixed up the adhesive separately. This just made it easier for me so I could have enough time to measure out all the walls, and I didn't have to worry about the setting time for the adhesive. Where possible, I marked out a centimeter away from the plasterboard. This is going to be acting as a guideline for me when I push the adhesive and the plasterboard together. The recommended is 1 centimeter. To mix the adhesive, I used a paddle mixer drill bit. I am using the Gyprock brand of adhesive here and found it to be pretty good. All the water mix ratio info was on the bag. Because of the size of bag I had and the bucket, I was only able to mix half a bag at a time. Once I had a smooth consistency, I started applying the dabs to the wall with a trowel. The dab depth that was recommended on the bag was 10 to 25 millimeters. It should also be fairly wide. This makes sure that when I do press the plasterboard against the adhesive, that I have a good consistent grab and contact. Once I had the boards on the wall, I used a straight edge and whacked the board to the correct depth, keeping an eye out on the guidelines and alignment. so there were no dips. I noticed a bit of a gap between one of the boards on the right, so I used shims to get them flush. Though if this did not work, I would be okay, as I'm going to come back with foam filler and fill all the gaps as needed. I continued to do the same for the two other walls and left adhesive to set for a day. When I came back the next day though, I noticed that one of the boards did not stay aligned and was a centimeter out of plumb. The only thing I could think that happened here is that I did not press the board in evenly enough and the board lost its grab from one side. Also, the window frame does get in the way a bit, so I could also have missed a couple angles. In the end, I decided to rip the part off the wall that was uneven. As I luckily had some leftover insulated board, I was able to patch it up. This was a good moment for me to see the strength of the grab, and even though it's only been a day, it was fairly stuck on. I needed to use my whole body weight for a good few minutes for it to budge. Once I got the board off, I chiseled out the adhesive off of the wall until it was smooth again. Though a bit frustrating to break apart work I just did, I was glad to fix this area, as I would have had to put more work when plastering to even it out, and also the trim would have been hard to align for the window. This time I also made sure to use a joist and some extra screws so that it doesn't move overnight and lose any of its alignments. As a safeguard, I installed some mechanical fixings in case the adhesive was to ever fail. I found these hammer-in fixings do a pretty good job as long as I use the washers like with the slanted ceiling boards. Without the washers, the screws popped right through the board, which was not great. I placed roughly 4 fixings per board. To maximize the effectiveness of the insulation board, I used expanding foam anywhere that had a gap larger than a couple millimeters. I also found this really neat trick in case some of the boards were not fully supported on the corners like over here. I could flex the board with a bit of pressure, which would crack the plaster. So to fix this, I drilled through the insulation with a bit that was roughly the same diameter as the spray foam nozzle and then filled it for a few seconds. Once the foam hardened, there was no movement at all. Once the spray foam was fully cured, I trimmed any excess off with a blade knife. To cut out the new electrical outlets and switches, I used a level and traced around the new casing. The casing lip is about 0.5 centimeter, so I made sure not to include that in the cutout. Once these minor jobs were done, I think I'm ready to take on taping and plastering the boards. Though to see how I do that, you will need to watch part 3 of the series. As always, thank you for watching, and please feel free to leave any feedback on what you found interesting or things that you think I should improve on.